Welcome everyone to the first edition of the Classic Comic Archive. In this series, I will be recapping and reviewing many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is The Amazing Spider-Man issue 1 from March of 1962. This issue marks the second appearance of Spider-Man and the first appearances of J. Jonah Jameson and the villainous Chameleon. As with many of Marvel's early comics, this issue is split into two independent stories featuring Spider-Man. The first story was scripted by Stan Lee, drawn by Steve Ditko, and lettered by Johnny D. Our issue begins with a brief retelling of Spider-Man's origin, as seen in Amazing Fantasy 15. Peter Parker, the civilian identity of Spider-Man, recounts how he was bitten by a radioactive spider, which gave him his incredible superhuman abilities. However, Peter first decided to use his powers as a performer in show business. Tragically, one night when Peter was off performing, his Uncle Ben was killed by a burglar. As Spider-Man, Peter vengefully tracked down his uncle's killer and turned him over to the police. In the present, we learn that Peter's guardian, Aunt May, is struggling to pay her bills after her husband's death. Peter offers to quit school and get a job to help, but Aunt May insists that he remain in school, so he can one day become a scientist like Uncle Ben had always hoped. In spite of Aunt May's advice, Peter still feels obligated to make money somehow. He briefly considers stealing money with the help of his powers, but he quickly discards the idea. Instead, Peter decides that he must continue performing as Spider-Man. A few days later, after amazing an audience with his abilities, Peter goes to collect his earnings. However, the booking agent is forced to make a check out to Spider-Man, as Peter refuses to reveal his true identity. Despite how smart Peter is shown to be, he somehow thinks that the bank will accept this check made out to Spider-Man. Of course, they don't. The next night, Spider-Man returns to his booking agent ready to perform. However, the booking agent tells Spider-Man that he's barred from performing anymore. He hands Spider-Man a copy of the newspaper The Daily Bugle. The newspaper's headline reads, "Spider-Man Menace." It's revealed that J. Jonah Jameson, the publisher of the Bugle, has written a scathing editorial calling for Spider-Man to be outlawed, as he sees the wall crawler as a lawless vigilante. Leaving the booking agent and returning to his civilian guise, Peter begins searching through the newspaper for help-wanted ads. He eventually finds a job advertised by a butcher, but is turned away for being meek. While searching through more ads, Peter witnesses his Aunt May pawn off some of her jewelry for extra cash. Knowing how much his Aunt May cares for him, Peter is more determined than ever to find a job. The next day, Peter decides to attend the public launch of an orbital spacecraft, piloted by astronaut John Jameson, the son of J. Jonah Jameson. The craft seemingly launches without a hitch, but an essential guidance unit quickly breaks off the craft as it ascends to space. Without the guidance unit, John Jameson is unable to steer the craft, and it starts descending towards Earth uncontrollably. Technicians on the ground attempt to halt the craft with a steel net, but their effort fails. While the technicians fear Jameson is doomed, Peter realizes he may have the power to save the pilot's life. Suiting up as Spider-Man, Peter travels to the spacecraft's control room. Making his presence known, Spider-Man offers to reattach a spare guidance unit to Jameson's craft. Despite the protests of J. Jonah Jameson, who was observing the launch within the control room, the lead supervisor of the launch agrees. Spider-Man then races to a nearby airfield and is able to convince a pilot to fly him to Jameson's craft. Once there, Spider-Man flings one of his sticky synthetic webs onto the craft and is yanked away from the plane at incredible speeds. Thanks to the strength of his grip and webbing, Spider-Man is able to climb onto the craft and attach the spare guidance unit. With the control of the craft restored, Jameson immediately launches a parachute and lands safely. Assured that Jameson is safe, Spider-Man quickly flees the scene and returns to his home and civilian guise. Although he did not save John Jameson for the recognition, Peter is confident that his deed will convince the public of his good nature. But when Peter reads the next edition of the Daily Bugle, he is shocked to see that J. Jonah Jameson continues to brand him a menace. We see that the elder Jameson has publicly accused Spider-Man of secretly sabotaging his son's craft, so he can then save the day and steal the spotlight. Evidently, Jameson's accusations were convincing to the public, as the authorities are pressured into declaring Spider-Man a wanted criminal. We even see that Aunt May herself believes Spider-Man should be imprisoned. Our first story in this issue subsequently ends, as we see Peter questions his future as Spider-Man. The second story in this issue was scripted by Stan Lee, drawn by Steve Ditko, and lettered by John Duffy. This splash page gives us our first look at the villain of this story, the Chameleon, as well as a tease of its guest stars, the Fantastic Four. As noted in the first half of this issue, Peter Parker is desperate to earn money to support his elderly guardian, Aunt May. Having failed to find a traditional job, Peter comes to the conclusion that he has to find a way to make money as Spider-Man. He ultimately decides that he will join the Fantastic Four under the wrongful assumption that they'll pay him as a member. In his civilian attire, Peter travels to the Baxter Building, the skyscraper headquarters of the Fantastic Four. However, Peter soon finds that only members of the super team can access the building. Undeterred, Peter suits up as Spider-Man and attempts to gain entry from the outside. As a quick side note, if you read closely, you can see that all throughout this issue, the name Peter Parker has been misprinted as Peter Palmer. But back to the story at hand, Spider-Man enters the building through an open window, an alarm is activated, and the Fantastic Four become aware of his presence. Seeing as how Spider-Man is currently wanted by the authorities, the Fantastic Four opt to trap him in a plexiglass cage until they know his true intentions. Spider-Man doesn't react well to this, and breaks free from his bonds using his super strength. The Thing of the Fantastic Four then assumes that Spider-Man is a threat, and lunges to attack the wall crawler. Spider-Man manages to dodge the Thing's attack, but at this point the other members of the Fantastic Four have joined in battle. Using his enhanced agility and spider sense, Spider-Man is able to avoid the Fantastic Four's attacks. However, as Spider-Man prepares to strike back, he is stopped by Mr. Fantastic, the leader of the Fantastic Four. Instead of attacking him, Mr. Fantastic simply asks Spider-Man what his intentions are. Spider-Man explains that he wants to become a paid member of the Fantastic Four, but the team quickly rebukes him, as they are a non-profit organization. This is all Spider-Man needs to hear, as without giving the Fantastic Four another chance to speak, he hastily leaves in frustration. The issue then shifts focus to a defense installation at the edge of the city, where we first meet the villain of this story, the Chameleon. It's shown that the Chameleon has subdued and restrained a janitor of the installation, and using his masterful abilities of disguise, has perfectly copied the janitor's appearance. To gain further entry into the restricted areas of the installation, the Chameleon then assumes the appearance of a research scientist and steals sensitive missile defense plans. Later that night at his secret hideout, we see that the Chameleon has arranged to sell the missile plans he stole to foreign agents. While he is musing to himself about the plans, the Chameleon notices an eye-catching TV news bulletin. He learns about Spider-Man's visit to the Fantastic Four, but the bulletin wrongly claims that Spider-Man is being considered for membership. The Chameleon then deduces that Spider-Man is desperate for money and can be lured into a trap. He plots to steal more plans, while using his powers of disguise to put the blame on Spider-Man. We then see that the Chameleon has rigged a communication device to transmit a frequency that only spider senses can hear. On this frequency, Chameleon broadcasts a message to Spider-Man that promises him a large profit if he travels to the source of the transmission. Peter Parker receives the message and obliges the Chameleon's request while suited up as Spider-Man, not knowing that he is walking into a trap. We then see that the Chameleon has broken into the defense installation disguised as Spider-Man. Posing as the wall crawler with a gun that shoots imitation webs, Chameleon is able to steal more missile plans. With the plans in tow, Chameleon hastily flees the installation in a helicopter parked on its roof. Just as the Chameleon is leaving, Spider-Man arrives, as the source of the transmission was the installation. On the building's roof, Spider-Man is met by police, who demand the stolen plans be returned. Spider-Man doesn't know what they're talking about, but quickly realizes he's been set up and flees. Spider-Man deduces that the pilot of the helicopter that he briefly saw leave the installation is the true thief, and uses his spider senses to track the Chameleon's whereabouts to the city's waterfront. Spider-Man arrives at the waterfront as the Chameleon is preparing to hand over the stolen plans to a secret Soviet submarine. Spider-Man luckily arrives in time and intercepts the exchange. Having been seen, the Soviets abandon the Chameleon and submerge back into the depths of the waterfront. The Chameleon isn't as quick, however, as Spider-Man is able to web onto his helicopter before he can escape. Spider-Man then uses his super strength to tear off the helicopter's sealed door and threatens to destroy the entire helicopter unless the Chameleon returns to the installation. The chameleon acquiesces and returns to the installation where the police are waiting for him. Spider-Man then exposes the chameleon's fraud and secures the stolen plans. However, Chameleon refuses to go down without a fight as he releases a smoke bomb to disorient his foes and mask an escape. Spider-Man pursues the chameleon back into the installation, but not before the dastardly villain has a chance to disguise himself as a policeman. Despite his clever disguise, Spider-Man detects the chameleon using his spider sense and begins to suspect his true identity. Knowing his ruse is up, the chameleon pulls a fuse and shuts down power to the installation's lights while he makes his final escape. Spider-Man is able to sense through the darkness and catches the chameleon before he can escape. As the lights turn back on, however, the chameleon cleverly attempts to trick the other policemen into thinking that Spider-Man is actually the chameleon in disguise. The police fall for the villain's trick and try to wrestle Spider-Man away from the disguised chameleon. Spider-Man breaks free of the policemen and furiously flees the building, frustrated with how easily they, and seemingly everyone, have turned on him. Nonetheless, Spider-Man was able to tear off a piece of Chameleon's police disguise in his escape, revealing underneath the fake Spider-Man costume. The issue subsequently ends as we see the chameleon being taken into custody, Spider-Man lamenting his status as a criminal, and the Fantastic Four contemplating Spider-Man's future. That concludes Amazing Spider-Man Issue 1 and the first episode of the Classic Comic Archive. Before I go, however, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought it was a great introduction to the character of Spider-Man, as well as a few of his supporting characters. I appreciated how Peter Parker, a teenage character, was written like an actual teenager. His attempt to cash a check made out to Spider-Man and his brash plan to join the Fantastic Four feel like things an immature teenager would do in his position. Speaking of the Fantastic Four, their guest appearance was particularly memorable, and I hope to see those characters appear more in this series. The Chameleon was also an interesting villain, enough that I find myself disappointed in knowing he makes few appearances in later issues. Something of interest I noted were some odd powers that Spider-Man displayed in this issue that I can't recall seeing in later stories. I am specifically talking about the spider frequency that only he can hear, as well as his ability to track the chameleon across the city using his spider sense. Perhaps as we progress through this series I will be proven wrong. I guess we'll just have to find out together. Please, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.